The transatlantic slave trade is considered the most horrifying and shameful period in human history. From 1525 to 1866, approximately 2.5 million Africans were forcibly driven out of their homes and transported to the other end of the earth, which was not the so-called American dream but endless cruel slavery and abuse. Today we need to take a look back at the Atlantic 500 years ago and see the life on slave ships. The first cargo ship was called the Guinean. The reason it was named is because there was a large amount of slave trade on the Guinea coast of West Africa. The demons would stuff hundreds or thousands of slaves into hellish pain. Before setting sail, the American merchants would strip the captured Africans of their clothes and shave them naked, and then tie their hair to the deck or temporary wooden structures. But this is just the beginning of a nightmare. When hundreds of African people were rejected like livestock, the men among them were chained and driven to the bottom of the deck. Do you think the women and children who stayed on the deck were lucky? The situation may be even worse. Although they were not bound by chains, they were forced to endure some female slaves of the crew, even because they suffered on the ship. Pregnant from abuse and entering the new world with pregnancy, men suffer in another way. Imagine hundreds of black men squeezed under the deck in a small space of dozens of square meters. The height of these compartments varies from ship to ship, with the smallest being only 25 centimeters and the highest being less than 1.5 meters. For an adult male, this is a nightmare. Men who are locked up in chains are forced to lie in these dark and small spaces, and they may even have difficulty breathing. During the journey that lasts for weeks or even months, they are allowed to move on the deck for an hour every day, exercise, and be washed with water. This so-called hygiene is not the kindness of the crew, but prison guards are ensuring the survival of their prisoners. Diseases are slave ships. One of the main killers on the sea is the lack of sanitation facilities in such a narrow space, let alone meeting the needs of bathing. They often vomit and excrete due to seasickness, which also needs to be solved in situ. In short, they need to cross the long and endless drift on the sea surface in their own vomit and excreta, which is the reason for the rampant disease. In slaves, dysentery, smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, and other diseases often erupt, and even the survivors are mostly weak. The illness was caused by the fact that they did not receive enough food. The slaves on board the ship were able to eat 2 meals a day. This was to ensure that the noble crew had enough food and that the slaves would receive a small amount of rice, beans, and 1 liter of water. This was the minimum survival requirement. The so-called suffering was not just punishment and abuse, but more spiritual torture and abuse. Many people tried to end their precious lives by going on hunger strikes or jumping off the ship, but for the captain, losing a slave meant losing a sum of money. Therefore, their prisoners did not have the right to end their lives. Slaves who attempted to starve were forcibly held down and used a tool called a peeper to open their mouths and engage in forced feeding. Suicide attempt. The criminal law that people face is even more terrifying, and the most common method of torture is the use of thumb screws and multi-tailed edges. These tortures mean a cruel, tearing sensation on the skin. Some crew members even pour sea salt onto the wounds of the most provocative slaves, causing unbearable pain. As a result, even the strongest slaves become weak and unable to rebel. Perhaps the rebellion has had a few moments of success. The most famous rebellion was in 1839. As the black slave trade neared its end, on a ship called the Friendship, those slaves began to stand up and resist the people who captured them. 53 African slaves successfully took over the ship, killing the chef and captain but sparing the crew's lives because they needed them to sail the ship back to their hometowns. However, even though they successfully resisted barehanded on a cargo ship in the Atlantic, they were ultimately defeated by the fully armed United States Navy. Ironically, the U.S. court ultimately ruled that the slave side was guilty and said they were not worthy of resisting centuries of transatlantic slave trade, which resulted in too many Africans dying on the transatlantic journey. Even though they managed to survive a hellish journey, there was still too much sadness and helplessness outside the port. Helping to separate from family and being cruelly tortured and enslaved by white people who were bought and sold is what life is like on a slave ship. But this is just a slice of the 300-year history of the black slave trade. See you in the next videos. Like and subscribe to receive the latest video notifications.